All parents hope that their children never become involved in the juvenile justice system. But for something so important, are you actually aware of the potential warning signs? And are your views of this system and its abilities to support teens, are they accurate? Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by PsyChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. This episode was made possible through a special PsyChi sponsorship with CSPP Alliant International University. If you'd like to learn about graduate programs at CSPP, be sure to check out the link in the show notes for this episode. Would you prefer to read along as you listen? A written transcript is available. See the link in the show notes for this episode. Joining me today is Dr. Anna Washington, an associate professor and associate director of clinical training of the APA Accredited Clinical PsyD program at the CSPP Alliant Sacramento campus. Dr. Washington previously worked at the UC David Care Center, which is spelled with two A's, CAARE. There, she focused on assessment and treatment of child abuse. She's provided expert testimony in more than 70 criminal court cases involving child sexual abuse, and she has extensive experience in conducting a range of evaluations, from child welfare evaluations to competency to stand trial and risk assessments for youth involved in the juvenile justice system. Dr. Washington, welcome to Psych Everywhere.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I think this is an interesting topic that we get to talk about today. I mean, I've got a kindergartner, and already, he comes home and says new things, and I see him picking up different behaviors that I'm not in control over, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, I hope this is never my child. I had never even considered that maybe my child could become involved in criminal justice system for one reason or the other. And then I kind of wonder, is that the right thing to be hoping for even? Maybe this system really does support people and I shouldn't be thinking about it in that light. So I think this is going to be a cool conversation. And my first question is, could you share some factors or situations? And I guess this could be like at an individual or a family or community level, but could you share some factors or situations that place a child or a teen at heightened risk of becoming involved with the juvenile court system?
Yeah, so I think most importantly, there's no one risk factor that would place a child at risk for juvenile justice involvement, and rather it is kind of this complex interplay of multiple risk factors, usually across individual, family, community, and societal levels. And I think the concern you mentioned there about not having control, maybe of all those risk factors and protective factors as a parent is a real one, and maybe a concern that lots of parents have. So starting with some risk factors at the individual level or kind of child level, we know that children who have a learning disability, for example, or more global cognitive or intellectual impairment can be at higher risk for juvenile justice involvement. We also know that children who have a history of trauma, mental health concerns, difficulties in school that could also include behavioral concerns like truancy would be at an increased risk of involvement in the justice system. And certainly also youth that have a friend group that, might engage in behaviors that aren't pro-social and then spend a lot of time in the community unsupervised with this particular friend group. At the family level, we also see that there are lots of different risk factors that could include some type of family dysfunction or a negative parent-child relationship. So a caregiver that has maybe a strained relationship with their child where they can't easily communicate about different things, where the child doesn't feel supported, or maybe where a caregiver, due to potentially their own mental health concerns or maybe a substance use concern, can't be fully responsive to that child's need. We might see at that family level too that, the experience of child abuse or child neglect would increase a child's risk for entering the juvenile justice system. And I think more importantly, or additionally, I should just say, exposure to domestic violence certainly also can increase that risk. And at the community level, there are a number of factors as well that can increase a child's risk. That would include living in a disadvantaged or under-resourced neighborhood, maybe where schools don't have the same funds as other neighborhoods, where children and families don't feel safe. It might be the presence of community violence, or high rates of poverty, for example. And there may also be a more negative relationship between community members and law enforcement. And I think importantly, kind of thinking through all these risk factors, is that um, I wouldn't necessarily consider the individual or family risk factors as root causes for juvenile justice involvement. And that's really because we're seeing that some youth, some families, some communities have higher rates of juvenile justice involvement. And that appears to be a reflection of issues that are also present in society more generally. So some families are experiencing poverty, discrimination, other types of oppression. And those families tend to also then have higher individual and family risk factors as a direct result of those societal injustices. And that increases their risk for juvenile justice involvement.
Of all these things you've mentioned, are there any of these warning signs or indicators that kind of go commonly overlooked by parents and really catch them off guard?
I think the most important one to me, and this may be a bias since it's also my area of kind of expertise, I would say that trauma exposure and related mental health symptoms is greatly overlooked and underestimated, certainly by the juvenile justice system, but I would say also by families as well as the youth. So we know that 80% of youth in the juvenile justice system have trauma exposure, and many of them have exposure to complex developmental trauma experiences. That could be, for example, the experience of child abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or other things that are, would be perpetrated interpersonally and maybe chronic and ongoing and also occurring at developmentally sensitive periods of that youth's life. And each of those trauma experiences can contribute to behavioral difficulties with emotion regulation and impulse control, difficulties connecting with others and building healthy relationships, increased conduct issues and risk-taking behaviors, and just a whole host of different behaviors that would increase someone's likelihood of becoming involved in the juvenile justice system.
So, could you share any effects that exposure to the juvenile court system might have on a child or a teen, either good or bad?
Absolutely. So I think the juvenile justice system can have either positive or negative effects. I think certainly the negative effects are maybe more common and more pronounced, but there can be positive effects too. So starting with those positive effects, I think something that can happen when a youth first is involved in the juvenile justice system is that there's an increased awareness for people around that youth that something is going on. Something is a concern for that youth. And they then start to think about, right, what those concerns are, and that youth might be connected with resources. They might, it might be identified that maybe there is current trauma happening, or that youth is not safe currently, or there's something happening in the family that needs to be addressed. And it is a way then for that youth and that family to gain additional support. I think one youth that I can remember, for example, from an evaluation that was placed in juvenile hall, described that he was happy to be there. And it was his, first time being able to feel like he could sleep through the night safely. He was able to get meals 3 times a day, and no one was, putting their hands on him. So this was a safe place for him. And I think that says a lot about the really challenging environments that sometimes youth are in prior to entering the juvenile justice system. And for that particular youth, it was a relief to be placed inside juvenile hall. I think that is fairly rare, right? Like, so out of the youth that I see for evaluations, most of them are not happy to be there, and most of them would rather be somewhere else. But again, occasionally it can really be a benefit to a youth to get that system involvement. On the negative side of things, I think we see that, youth who are entering the juvenile justice system often have disruptions in other systems in their lives where they have positive connections. So they might be removed from the people that care about them and that they have connections with. Their families, for example, aren't able to see them, and so they are, right, not as close then with their family members and siblings. They might lose some positive peer connections. They might lose motivation to participate in school after having missed a certain amount of time attending school. And that makes it harder for them to re-enter their community and, kind of pick up their pro-social goals and habits. We might also see that youth who are placed in facilities, for example, with other youth who have conduct issues, might pick up new behaviors, for example, or might experience that their maybe a certain kind of identity is reinforced, and that's not something that's going to put them on a positive path forward. In addition to that, I think, unfortunately, sometimes youth experience trauma inside the juvenile justice system as well. And then that added trauma experience leads to additional or more severe delinquency concerns and an increased risk for recidivism as well.
What is the number one thing that parents could do to keep their kids from needing to be introduced to the juvenile court system?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, back to that tricky thing about what's in parents' control, right? So I just want to acknowledge that lots of things are outside of parents' control. And I think in particular, parents who hold less privilege or have less resources. That said, there certainly are lots of things that parents can do, both with regards to kind of reducing risk and increasing protective factors as well. I would say kind of number one would be to build a positive relationship with their child. So creating a positive bond or attachment with their child, enjoy spending time with their child, supporting that child's development, and regularly talking about different things and concerns and negative emotions that child or youth might experience. And I'd add to that kind of number two thing would be, to kind of counter, right, unsupervised time in the community, maybe with someone who isn't a good influence, would be instead to connect their child to getting involved in some type of structured activity where there are both, positive role models, healthy peers with pro-social goals, and there's an opportunity for kind of a sense of mastery. So, for example, involvement in sports, then you can have, right, a coach that you're building a relationship with. You have positive relationships with your teammates, and you're engaged in something that isn't going to get you in trouble. And it might make you feel good to know that you're really good at something. Doesn't have to be sports, could be, any other kind of activity, but just anything, again, where you're building positive relationships with different kinds of people, and you are spending time doing something enjoyable that won't get you in trouble.
I guess since this is a psychology podcast, I'll ask, how should or does a parent feel if their child enters the juvenile court system?
That's a really great question. I don't think there is a right or wrong way to feel necessarily. I think that um, parents can react in lots of different ways. So some parents, I think, are scared, surprised, anxious, just upset, maybe infuriated, and yet others might feel some relief because they may have had a child that has had some behavioral challenges for a long time, and they haven't had the resources or ability to support that child. And it may feel like a relief to have someone else that is potentially able to support that child's functioning moving forward. I think that the juvenile justice system also often feels overwhelming to navigate. So many parents, I think, might feel like they don't quite know what to do, how they can support their child, what the next steps are. They might not have had good experiences with various child serving systems in the past, and so may also not really trust the process. And they may, pending the experiences their child has in the system, you know, have, I suppose, further mistrust of that system as well moving forward. And I think maybe a couple of things that could reassure parents in some ways would be that I think many parents think juvenile justice involvement and sort of incarceration, right? So if my child has contact with the system, if they get arrested, if they get detained, adjudicated, they are going to spend some time incarcerated. And that feels like a really negative thing. While that certainly can happen, a lot of arrests don't necessarily lead to formal petition, and for youth who end up being adjudicated through the system, more than half, I think, sort of national average, 60% or so, have the consequence of being released to the community on probation with some services. And so there may be then that your child is not necessarily away from you. They may be in your care, you're supervising them, and you are given some additional supports from the court to address, for example, mental health concerns.
What about educators? Are there any things that they can do from their end to identify and address issues that might lead to a child's involvement in the juvenile court system?
Yes, absolutely. I think educators or really adults in any system or any place can help reduce the risk of youth. So I would say for educators, it's really helpful if they are looking out for some warning signs. So again, youth who are not doing well academically, they just have a hard time understanding materials. They're not getting good grades. And then more on the social side, they're not able to maybe make and maintain friendships, and so feel more isolated, or may show some other behavioral concerns. So just don't seem like they are happy, stop showing up to class, get into a lot of fights. So those would be the kids to be looking out for. And I think it can be tremendously helpful for youth to have, again, just one positive relationship with someone So if, for example, they don't have that at home, but can establish that or with an educator, that can reduce their risk. So if they have one person that cares about them, that wants them to do well, that can guide them, mentor them, and support them, that can make a really big difference. And I think educators can also connect youth to other resources and services that might be helpful. So maybe there's a school counselor that could be really helpful for that child, but the child wouldn't really know to go to that person on their own.
Could you tell us any about forensic evaluations, and particularly like any key challenges or complexities that are involved in conducting those?
Yes, absolutely. So forensic evaluations can again be any kind of psychological evaluation that is completed within the legal context. And for me specifically, I am focused on doing a couple of different evaluations within the juvenile justice context. The evaluations I most commonly or typically complete would be juvenile competency to stand trial evaluations, risk assessments, which are usually related to um, juvenile sex offenses, and then also disposition evaluations. Starting with the juvenile competency to stand trial evaluations, that is a type of evaluation that aims to determine whether a child or teenager is able to understand the legal context and also whether they're able to assist in their own defense. Some children and teenagers are able to understand the legal context and can effectively aid in their defense, but not all children are able to do so. For example, if a youth has ADHD, for example, it might be that it would be challenging for them to sit through a long court hearing. It might be that they would interrupt, perhaps, or blurt out some information that could incriminate them during the court hearing, and that a defense attorney or it wouldn't be fast enough to stop them from saying those things. And it could also be that they might talk about certain things or respond to certain questions in a way that's not as easily understood by court professionals. So that's just one example there. For youth that might be experiencing psychosis, for example, their hallucinations could get in the way of them being able to focus on the information that's presented to them. And I think also, for youth who've experienced trauma specifically, which again is one of my key interests, it may be that youth are really reactive to trauma triggers. It might be that they could dissociate when certain information is presented in court. It could be that they are also more impulsive or not as well regulated during court hearings. And certainly to that, due to experiences, if they involve interpersonal trauma, they may have difficulty trusting others. And this may include not being able to trust their own defense attorney. And if you don't trust that defense attorney and you don't feel like you want to share relevant information with them, it's really hard for them to assist you in being able to come up with a defense.
I'm curious to kind of hear a little more about these evaluations. Like, let's say competency to stand trial. Could you help me picture that, I guess? Like, it's not written, right? It would be like a face-to-face interview or something like that?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for asking
Okay.
that question. So to just set the context for that, typically these evaluations are, I'd say, roughly 3 hours long. It would be a face-to-face evaluation, pending whether the youth is, say, placed in the right juvenile hall. It might be that I would meet with that youth either in a visitation room or sometimes a no contact room in juvenile hall. Other times, if the youth has been released into the community, they would then come into a mental health clinic and have a face to face visit in that clinic. And typically what takes place during those appointments would be some combination of a general clinical interview where I would ask about the youth's academic history, their personal experiences, their family history, their cultural background, to kind of get a general sense of uh, what their history is and their recent circumstances. Then it would also include often some kind of a cognitive or intellectual screen just to get a sense of the kind of developmental ability that child has. Ballpark estimate, because this is screen, not full comprehensive evaluation. It also often includes a trauma screen to be able to identify trauma exposures that youth may have had. And if they have had some, then it would also be relevant to assess trauma symptoms specifically, as well as other mental health and behavioral symptoms. The last piece that's key to doing this kind of evaluation would be to do a semi-structured interview related to competency specifically. And then you're also throughout this evaluation making observations, right, about their ability to pay attention, their ability to connect with me as the evaluator, which then likely also may relate to their trust and ability to connect to other people in the legal system. And you're noticing any other behaviors that might interfere with them sitting through a longer court hearing, for example. So it's a lot of different pieces that go into it, along with review of their records. So school records, if there are medical mental health records available, looking through that, typically contacting some collaterals as well. So that could include a caregiver, for example, or any other adult that knows that child, to also ask some relevant questions related to competency. And I think importantly too, the conclusions of that report wouldn't just be yes, no, they're competent or not, but it would also speak to potential treatment needs or referrals that are needed. So if, for example, through that IQ screen that might be administered, it appears that a youth may have some impairment, then a referral would be made to the regional center for further assessment. And if it's identified then that this youth perhaps has an intellectual disability, then they would be able to access a lot more resources through that referral. And similarly, if any mental health concerns are identified, including, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, then there would be treatment recommendations related to services that would help reduce those particular symptoms.
It occurred to me as you were explaining the process that maybe she's evaluating me right now.
I'm not, I promise.
Could you share some examples of interventions or strategies that have proven successful in addressing the needs of youth who get involved in the juvenile court system?
Yes. So there are some really good interventions out there. I think important to keep in mind would be that, again, there are these multiple risk factors that tend to converge to increase someone's risk for juvenile justice involvement. That also means that interventions that address multiple risks across multiple levels or systems also tend to be most effective. For example, there is an evidence-based treatment called multisystemic therapy, so MST for short, that can be really effective with this population. And it is a treatment where there would be a team really of clinicians that would work with the youth, the family, and also be thinking about community exposures, peers, kind of involvement in various activities to try to reduce risks and increase protective factors in each of these systems at the same time. And so that is a pretty intensive treatment. Pending what particular concerns the youth has, it may be that isn't a good fit. So there are lots of different treatments. And for youth who have a trauma history, for example, and it may have trauma systems that or trauma symptoms that directly, lead to or exacerbate their juvenile justice involvement, they may benefit from trauma treatment. One example might be an evidence-based treatment called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT for short. So that would be a treatment that directly reduces or addresses trauma symptoms for that youth. And there are lots of other outpatient interventions like that that have empirical support related to mental health concerns. I think a tricky thing, though, is, well, there are a couple of tricky things. So one, I would say, is that not all of these treatments are available everywhere. And MST, for example, that is a, really effective treatment, is only available in certain parts of the country or in certain zip codes or certain counties. And so sometimes youth who really need these treatments can't access them. And for other youth, there may also be that we don't have evidence-based treatment to really effectively help them. I think that is often the case for youth who are involved in gangs, for example. It's really hard once you have joined a gang to decide that you no longer want to be part of that gang. And even if you have received some treatment and you're doing better, once you're returning to your family and your neighborhood, that gang is still there and you're still part of it. And it can be challenging to completely change your peer group or engage in different behaviors, for example. So there are lots of things that we just don't have super effective treatments for. I think the other issue related to that, again, is that many of the risk factors, again, that makes it likely that somebody is going to get involved in the juvenile justice system are at societal level. The interventions we have often are individual or family level interventions. And even though you can give someone coping skills, right, you can treat their trauma symptoms, their mental health symptoms, if they are returning to an environment that is unsafe, oppressive, or where they're experiencing constant racism or other isms, like homophobia, transphobia, they're likely to continue to have the same challenges and the same risks that they had prior to completing an individually focused treatment.
You mentioned earlier on in the conversation, I think, something that I wanted to come back to, which is in what ways are some teens at a disadvantage in the juvenile justice system due to their race or ethnicity, religion, and so things like that?
Yes, I think it's really important to talk about that because we know that there are disproportionate contact kind of for some groups versus others in the juvenile justice system, and that there are some real disparities related to juvenile justice outcomes. And I think those are reflective of the same general health disparities and mental health disparities that we see in society more generally. And so youth that would be at higher risk, say, of juvenile justice involvement would be youth that come from marginalized or minoritized communities. For example, we see that a lot of Black boys or Latinx boys might enter the juvenile justice system. And there are lots of reasons for that, some of it being risk factors at each of these levels that make it more likely that some children then have, for example, mental health concerns or difficulties with emotion regulation that place them at risk for delinquency. But more importantly, I think, we know that there's over policing of certain communities. Some children are more likely to be arrested rather than others. Some schools have policies that are stricter than others related to when they call the police or what they call certain behavioral difficulties. And once someone is involved in the juvenile justice system, there may also be um, bias and differences in what cases get prosecuted, what type of sentencing certain people get, but not others, so that harshness of the sentencing, as well as their um, recidivism or even the effectiveness of mental health services that are recommended. And now that I say that, I do think it's also important to acknowledge that, again, those disparities that we're seeing in the juvenile justice system are also present in psychology, right? And so we have a tendency, I think, in psychological research, for example, to sometimes have a very individual focus and deficits focus, not focusing on certain populations rather than others. And we don't always have culturally responsive assessments and treatments. So there's a lot of growth, I think, across the board, right? The forensic evaluations, the mental health treatments, juvenile justice system, and society at large in that area.
How do you navigate cultural and socioeconomic factors when working with diverse groups of youth in the juvenile justice system?
I think that's a great question. And I think I just want to go back to saying too that, again, I think thinking of the juvenile justice system through a trauma-informed lens is really important. And I think it's relevant for this question too. And so I think shifting our focus more generally from, right, why is this youth bad, or why do they have these bad behaviors, to what bad things may have happened to them. And I think it's really important to be, right, asking questions about not just trauma exposure, but also specifically maybe experiences related to racial trauma or poverty or neglect or any number of these risk factors that we see from the research literature really make a difference in a youth's life. And I think more practically, when I'm doing evaluations, sometimes what is helpful too is, building trust with the youth so that they feel comfortable sharing relevant things with me. It helps, I think, to be transparent during evaluations, to make it really clear why I'm doing an evaluation, who I am, and where this information is going, what my limitations are, right, and what happens with the information they're sharing with me. I also think it's helpful to give youth some sense of control during that process so that they are, fully informed about what the evaluation is intending to do, and they have a choice to participate or not participate, or share certain information and not share information. I also think acknowledging differences, right, between myself and the client can be helpful as well. And so in instances, for example, when someone has a background that's very different from myself, that might be something that I acknowledge, and I might invite them to share with me if there's anything that they would want to talk about related to that, or any concerns they have related to that. And then as it relates to the assessment specifically, there are certain assessment tools that are more culturally sensitive than others. And so thinking about who the youth is, what their cultural background is, what their preferred language is, and then choosing an assessment tool that would be a good fit for that. And also making sure to not make assumptions and ask questions about the context of different things. As an example, I'm thinking of maybe youth who carry some kind of weapon, right? I think it's easy to think that if somebody has a gun, they were intending to use it for some kind of bad purpose, right? And so they had this intention of doing some harm to someone. But we know from research that a lot of people, a lot of youth in neighborhoods that are in violence carry weapons for protection, not necessarily with a specific purpose of harming someone. And so kind of thinking about the particular cultural context of that youth, which may be very different from mine. And again, asking about specific things that I might wonder about.
Okay, last question. What are some common misconceptions or myths about the juvenile justice system?
So I would say that there are probably lots of different misconceptions and myths. And I think it depends on a little bit of who you're thinking of, sort of who, right, has those misconceptions. But I think in general, people who think about juvenile justice involvement tend to be overly focused on individual versus systemic factors, both in terms of kind of, again, risk factors for, right, who is entering the juvenile justice system, but also in thinking through interventions, for example. So I think it's important to zoom out during discussions about even forensic evaluations, which are very individually focused. I think I'd say too, I think that while sometimes it might feel like there's maybe some, I shouldn't say hopelessness, but I think sometimes as a, say, provider working within this context, I think you can see a lot of systems failures, right? You see youth enter that really needed services 10 years ago, and there were these missed opportunities to provide them with those services. And it's really hard to intervene maybe at that later point when I'm meeting with them. It might also be youth that have had a lot of trauma exposures and are likely to continue to experience trauma. And so you hear a lot of, really bad stories, and you see youth who are trying really hard and who maybe have families that are trying really hard, yet they have all these kind of risk factors working against them and end up in these really tricky situations. So again, on the provider end of things, I think that can lead to some cynicism and feeling like, right, there's this system that isn't helping anyone, right? And it might feel punitive, and like our psychological assessments or interventions maybe aren't addressing the things that are really important. But I think it's also important to realize that there are changes in the juvenile justice system. I think it can be really helpful as a psychologist to make various court professionals, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys aware of the mental health concerns that a youth has and how that may impact their risks, their participation in the court process, and their ability to be responsive to certain interventions. And I think our court systems are moving to becoming more trauma informed, slowly but surely. There are lots of people, I think, that really care about youth. There are trauma informed courts developing. There are tons of resources offered, for example, by the NCTSN or the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, specifically focusing on trauma informed care for example, right, judges or prosecutors or defense attorneys. And I think probation as a field too is moving to becoming much more trauma informed. And so I think there are these positive shifts happening in the juvenile justice system. And as a psychologist, we can help affect some positive change as well within that system.
Okay. Well, I came into this really not knowing a lot about juvenile justice system, and I feel like you've really helped me to kind of create a better picture of it and kind of understand this world a little bit more than I did, and certainly more than what I would have learned on Judge Judy or Law and Order. And your answers were just really articulate and well thought out, and I felt like you gave me so many great details and things to hang on to and remember later, and I just want to thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This episode was made possible through a PsyChi sponsorship with the Alliant International University, California School of Professional Psychology. Founded in 1969, CSPP was one of the nation's first independent schools of professional psychology. Today, CSPP continues its commitment to preparing the next generation of mental health professionals and advocates. Their dedication to ensuring every community's access to quality mental health care extends from integrated care to inclusive family therapy. Explore their programs at https://info.alliant.edu/partner-psychi. And I'll put a link in the show notes too. Real quick, I wanted to take a moment to introduce you to the PsyChi Career Center, where you can browse thousands of psychology-related jobs. The Career Center includes jobs not only for those with a doctorate in psychology, but also for anyone with a bachelor's, minor, or master's. You can now set job alerts to find out when new jobs are posted that match your career interests. And importantly, the Career Center is completely free for job seekers. Go check it out online. I'll put a link in the show notes for this too. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, go ahead and follow us wherever you go for podcasts. Tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Word of mouth is a huge help for podcasts. So share what you learned at the dinner table or in your classes. You can also follow us on Twitter at PsyChi Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcast or wherever you go for podcasts. You'll absolutely make my day. And more importantly, you'll be helping us to get Psych everywhere. Okay, that's all for now. I'll connect with you again soon. Copyright 2024, PsyChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.